Can there be such a thing as an American paganism? I don't mean paganism as practiced by Americans. There are certainly many forms of that already. But what about a paganism that's specifically American? One that worships American deities with American ritual styles and celebrates American holidays? I think this sort of thing is possible. Certainly, the American population has been overwhelmingly Christian right from the beginning, which raises the question of how we can talk of the gods and goddesses of the American people. Also, our government is radically secular, so we can't talk about the deities of the state like ancient Romans could. But if we look at the art and architecture of America, especially from the years up till World War II, and particularly of government buildings, we find a strong pagan presence. This is no surprise, since the American philosophy and the ideas of the founders were shaped strongly by those of ancient Greece and Rome. So we find, for example, the Parthenon-influenced Lincoln Memorial and the Roman fasces, a bundle of rods around an axe used as a symbol of the Republic. Pagan influence goes further, though, into the American system of symbols. That's where we find a surprising number of gods and goddesses. In fact, once we know where to look, we'll find them all over, in statues, paintings, illustrations, songs, and other writings. To be sure, the people who created these art works were and are Christians and Jews, for whom these deities were just allegories or symbols, but there's no reason we pagans can't treat them as if they were actual deities. They're already here, and in them we have a ready-made pantheon that's already been woven into American life. I'm not going to argue about separation of church and state here. I'm looking at a paganism which incorporates American ideas, not one that insists on a government that incorporates pagan ones. Also, I won't include figures from American Indian cultures. That would raise all sorts of questions about cultural appropriation. Besides, those figures are adapted to their own cultures, not the general American ones, so they don't belong to the categories I'll be dealing with here. And third, keep in mind that I'm talking about ideals here, not actualities. I know very well that things aren't the way they represent them to be, but they're still things that are there to strive for. They're role models, showing what America could be, should be. By their very premise as objects of worship, they challenge us to make them manifest. I don't want discussion of current political situations in the comments, not even the extent to which we are or are not living up to these ideals. That's a discussion for another day. So let's look at what I mean when I talk of American deities. Not all of these are specific to America and are honored in other lands, but in general, the U.S. has put its own spin on them. They can be divided into four categories. First is a special one made up of three goddesses. Second, there are deities that come from ancient pagan cultures but have been accepted into ours as well. Third are deified abstractions. Finally, there are geographical and geopolitical deities. These categories overlap some. For instance, some of the ancient gods were originally abstractions. Let's start then. The first category is made up of Liberty, Minerva, and another goddess who is variously called America and Columbia. These three are the most important of the American deities. Many ancient cultures had sovereignty deities, those who gave the people the right to exist, and who, above all deities, protected an area. Often they were female. As such, they represented the land. America's sovereignty goddess is different, though. She represents not the physical land or its people, but the main principle behind our way of life. She is the justification for the existence of America. I'm talking about liberty. Liberty is descended from the Roman Libertas, who was the goddess of freed slaves. Her symbol was the liberty cap, the pileus, a soft felt cap, usually red, which she either wore or carried on a pole. This was because pilei were worn by freed slaves. Here she is with her pole on a Roman coin. In some parts of the American colonies, a tall pole with a liberty cap on its top became something around which patriots gathered for political meetings and protests. Unfortunately, nowadays the only representation you're likely to see of liberty is a statue in New York. I recognize that that statue is a magnificent one, but it's sad that artists have stopped designing their own liberties. I think it's odd that images of liberty of all deities have become limited. I'm going to show some images from earlier times to show how variously she was represented, and if you're an artist, to inspire you in your own artwork. This one is from the Capitol building. The snake is a symbol of wisdom, and the eagle is of course a national symbol. Note that she's wearing feathers. This was common in early depictions, and was taken from early images of the goddess America. Liberty is often shown with an eagle. The most famous such representation is shown here. Liberty is crushing a chain, a scepter, and a key under her feet. Her altar is behind her, and above her in the clouds is an American flag with a liberty cap on top of its pole. The title is Liberty Feeding the Eagle, but she's actually offering it a drink. The giving of a drink as a sign of giving sovereignty was common in Celtic and Germanic mythology, although I doubt the artist knew that. This one is from the Apotheosis of Washington, the mural painted inside the dome of the national capitol, in which George Washington is raised to heaven. Here liberty is accompanied by justice, who I'll talk about later. She carries the fasces, a symbol of civic law, to show that the United States is a republic. Fasces were carried in front of a number of processions in ancient Rome. This would make a wonderful ritual act in an American paganism. In this picture, Liberty appears on a cloud with light shining behind her as befits a goddess. The prince says proudly, "We owe allegiance to no crown," even as Liberty crowns a sailor. He holds the American flag, showing Liberty's sovereignty aspect. Through the sailor, she's crowning America. Here's a particularly beautiful image from the Wisconsin state capitol. I'm not sure what the symbolism of the sphere is. Maybe it invokes her sovereignty over the world. I find this poster from World War I very moving. Holding an American flag, Liberty presents the laurel crown to a memorial with the names of Americans who've died in the war, proclaiming them all to be Americans. Just look at the names: English, Irish, Greek, several forms of Eastern European, Jewish, Scandinavian, Hispanic, Americans all. A good lesson to remember today. Sometimes things get erotic. After all, she's Liberty, so she belongs to all of us, and love for her, like any love, can turn sexual. I love these two related images on postcards. There's nothing to identify her as Liberty, but the captions tell us she is. She's clearly wearing nothing but a flag, and a meaning for the one with a cannon would be obvious to Freudian. In World War II bomber nose art, we see a variety of levels of eroticism. So here she is dressed skimpily under the name Liberty Bell. She loses some of her clothes on another bomber of the same name. And on this bomber, she's lost them completely. Love of liberty can take many forms, and she can present herself to us in as open a way as we and she would wish. Before coins had presidents on them, they were required to have liberty on the front. It's sad that she's been replaced by presidents, as if they were emperors or kings. She's been reduced to just her name. Here are some images of her on coins before she was taken off. The Standing Liberty Quarter caused an uproar when it first came out because she was depicted with one breast showing. In the next year's striking, her breast was covered. Those of us who are older have used what's usually called a Mercury dime because of the wings on her head, but it's definitely meant to be Liberty. And here's the one on what's considered the most beautiful American coin ever, a $20 gold coin designed by St. Gaudens. The second in the trio is the Roman goddess Minerva, who, as we'll see, rarely appears alone. She's usually accompanied either by another goddess or is syncretized with one. This is a magnificent statue of her in Herald Square in New York. She's most often shown as a goddess of wisdom, teaching, and learning. Here we find her on a mural in, appropriately enough, the Library of Congress. And here, in the Apotheosis of Washington, is implied that she inspired the invention of the steamboat, Morse code, and the printing press, and inspired her knowledge of electricity. She's therefore identified here not simply as an ancient goddess, but one who's active today. Minerva can be identified by her armor, particularly her helmet and her spear. Minerva is therefore sometimes seen in warrior mode, as here on the Medal of Honor. Here on the Seal of California, she appears in a protective role, watching over the settling of the state, helped by California's bear icon. She's not static, she leads settlers. Minerva and Liberty have a close connection. We've seen Liberty syncretized with Minerva, holding Minerva's spear. Sometimes, though, the two goddesses are separate, but have a close relation with each other. This Minerva stands on Brooklyn Heights, where battle was fought during the Revolutionary War. In her role as a martial goddess, she salutes the Statue of Liberty, reassuring Liberty that she always stands ready for her service, protecting not just the land, but liberty itself. Also in New York City, this time in Manhattan, is this wonderful one, where Minerva and Liberty are shaking hands. They formed a compact. The final member of the trio is America herself, who is sometimes called Columbia. She's depicted as a young woman. In some cases, like Liberty, she has erotic overtones. She usually can be distinguished by either wearing a flag or carrying a shield with the U.S. arms on it, or both, although that's not a sure bet, because as we've seen, Liberty sometimes has them too. In the early years of the country, though, especially before independence, she was depicted as an Indian, especially in images created by Europeans. Here we see her reconciling with the goddess Britannia at the end of the Revolutionary War. The skirt of tobacco leaves is interesting, but it's a feather that'll show up in later images. Appropriately, she's shown in updated versions through the years. This one, celebrating the end of the Civil War, specifically comments on how she's put on a new costume. Here is another updated version entitled America, Our National Hymn. Note the broken chains at her feet connecting her with liberty. Here America raises her sword to protect the victims of the Armenian genocide, calling on Americans to look beyond their borders, declaring that they have a responsibility to people in other countries. I think that this image of Columbia from the Columbian Exposition is especially beautiful. Here she's somewhat erotic in a partially see-through dress, striding forward, showing a little leg and some cleavage. America is protective of science and industry at the Smithsonian Institute. Her outstretched arms seem enough to give protection, but she also has a sword. Note that again her hat has feathers on it and that she is dressed in a virtually see-through robe. We see her then again in a semi-erotic manner. One feature that survives throughout all her representations, however, is that she's always young. This is appropriate for a country that's ever reinventing itself, ever recognizing the necessity of change, ever trying to live up to its ideals. The three goddesses may accompany each other, or they may be syncretized. Just as America is often shown with a liberty cap, liberty is often shown in an American flag dress, or with an American flag or a seal. Here we see her holding an American flag and with a star-spangled dress. We've already seen her with the feathers which connect her with America. On the capital frieze, Liberty carries Minerva's spear and America's shield and wears her own cap. She protects history on her left and America on her right. It's interesting that here America and Liberty each have their own eagle, both uniting and distinguishing them. This is my favorite image of Minerva and America together. It's on the base of a statue of John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. Here Minerva is dictating the Constitution to America. We know, of course, that the Constitution was the result of arguments, compromises, and hard work by some brilliant men, but I like the idea that they were guided by Minerva. In my view, Liberty is a sovereignty goddess who turns the practical side of making a home for her in this country over to Minerva, and then Minerva inspires the system we now have. I feel a little bad for Minerva. She doesn't get the credit she deserves. The second category is Roman deities. Their presence in the American pantheon comes from the influence of the classical world on the thoughts of the founding fathers and on artists and architects, particularly in the early days of the Republic. Because so many countries have been affected by classical culture, these deities don't, of course, belong to America alone. Still, they're present here, although Americans have given the deities their own spin, emphasizing some functions, diminishing others, and adding still more. We've already seen the apotheosis of Washington. Included in our images of some of the Roman gods and goddesses important to America. Let's go through them. We've already talked about Minerva, so let's skip to Neptune. In the apotheosis, he's accompanied by Venus, who amusingly is shown helping to lay the first transatlantic cable, something she isn't known for doing in ancient Rome. Neptune doesn't show up much in America, which is odd when you figure how important the ocean is to America's economy and military. He does appear in this fountain outside the Library of Congress's Thomas Jefferson building and in a recent sculpture from Virginia Beach. His weapon, the trident, does show up, predictably, on emblems used by the Navy. The most famous is probably that of the SEALs. The trident is also found on the emblem of Annapolis, and of course on those units armed with the Trident missile. Moving on, we come to Mercury. Here in the apotheosis he represents commerce. He's shown giving a bag of money to Robert Morris, an important financier of the American Revolutionary War. To his right, men are hard at work, and to his left, sailors are bringing an anchor into the maritime theme, thereby linking commerce and sea transport. The most famous statue of Mercury in the United States is probably the one on Grand Central Station in New York. Here he stands for transportation, commerce, or both. He's flanked by Hercules, a god of travel and merchants, and Minerva, who may be there as a goddess of the skill that goes into manufacturing, and thus indirectly of cargo. In American art, therefore, Mercury appears as a god of commerce, the economy, and finance. The American financial system is very different from the Roman one, and our Mercury watches over ours, not theirs. In the American system, Mercury has completely lost his role as psychopomp and herald of the gods, although he's kept the caduceus and winged hat, which symbolize them. Next on the apotheosis is Vulcan. He works at his anvil naked to the waist as he often is, and smithing is hard work. He's working on weapons, but there's also the smokestack of a steam engine behind him. Like Neptune, Vulcan doesn't show up often, but there's a great statue of him found on a 126-foot-high pillar overlooking Birmingham, Alabama. At 56 feet tall and weighing 60 tons, this is the largest cast iron statue in the world. It's there to honor the history of iron and steel working in the city, but I love that there's a huge statue of a bare-bottomed pagan god looming over a city firmly in the Bible Belt. Finally, we have Ceres, who sits on a reaper whose reins are held by America. She smoothly made the transition from hand-wielded sickle to machine. In the foreground is Flora, goddess of flowers. Ceres shows up in a number of places throughout the country. Here she is on the top of the Missouri Capitol, and here on the Vermont one. There are two amazing Art Deco versions of her at the Chicago Bureau of Trade, a statue in the top of the building, and a 3-story mural in the atrium. Note how a classical goddess has been represented in a modern style. Even when it comes to classical deities, America isn't stuck in the past. Now let's look at the goddesses in the center. We've already seen Liberty, the other goddess is Victory. She holds a laurel branch and wears a laurel wreath like those worn by victors at the Olympian Games in ancient Greece. Representations of her are very common throughout the country, especially on war memorials. Here she leads General Sherman in New York City. The goddess in the classical deity category who's found the most often is Justice. She's usually shown in her traditional form, blindfolded and carrying the sword of her power and the scales of decision, as in this statue of her from the Williamsburg County Courthouse in Virginia. She's also usually shown stayed, either standing upright or seated. She's also found in other poses, such as in this beautifully proportioned image from Fort Wayne, Indiana. And no one would call this statue from the St. Louis University of Law stayed. I love her dynamic pose. There can also be a hint of eroticism about her that's even more blatantly expressed in this relief from West Bend, Wisconsin. Note the Fasces. Here she is justice under law. Under the name The Spirit of Justice, she accompanies the Majesty of Justice, the Robert F. Kennedy Department of Justice building. This statue became famous when a blue curtain was placed between the statues and the lectern from which John Ashcroft gave press briefings, apparently because he didn't like being photographed with a woman with a bare breast showing behind him. So justice appears in many forms, showing that the symbolism and even concept of justice in America is different from that of ancient Greece and Rome, and indeed from many of other countries of the world, where she almost always appears in the classical form. There are lots of other statues and reliefs of justice all over the internet if you're interested. Summing up these first two categories, we find classical deities and a classical way of creating deities. Yet there's an American spin on these deities, and this can be emphasized and increased in an American pagan system. The first way is in the choice of deities. We don't see Juno or Hades often, for instance. They would be inconsistent with the energy and optimism of America. The second way is to modify the classical deities somewhat. This was done in ancient times. The psychopomp aspect of Mercury seems to have completely disappeared when he was worshipped by the Gauls. In America, we've seen how he's added transportation to his functions, and employment could be added as well. If we were to adopt democracy from ancient Greece, we certainly wouldn't be adopting a principle that denied the vote to women and slaves. The founding of America was influenced by Greece and Rome, but those influences were combined with many other things, the principles of the Enlightenment, British common law, and many others, the most important of which was the nature of the American personality that had developed from such things as the type of person who would emigrate in the act of making a living in a new world. Since the American system and culture which developed were unique, we can make a unique pantheon from the classical deities. The third category is deified abstractions. We've already seen some of these. What are justice and liberty if not deified abstractions? The idea of turning an abstract concept into a deity goes way back then. If, as the ancient Greco-Romans did, we think of deifying abstractions as a reasonable thing to do, we can use the depictions we already have to depict deities. The ones I'm going to talk about here are ones that are transparently abstractions. The possibilities are open-ended. Because many Americans, especially artists, were comfortable depicting abstract concepts in deified forms as allegories, these are frequently found in American art. Some of the deified abstractions represent economic concepts. Calvin Coolidge famously said, "The business of America is business," and we certainly see this in personifications of abstractions. The importance and identities of which ones are depicted change over time with subcultures and regions, of course. an agricultural area is unlikely to put up statues of industry. Let's start with him or her. Industry is depicted both ways. Here he's depicted in the form of Mercury on the Manhattan Bridge. Industry is often found as Mercury or with some of Mercury's attributes. This is a modern one from Lake Charles, Louisiana, entitled The Industry Man. Technically a worker, he can stand in for industry itself. He's depicted as one of us with hard hat and work clothes and carries a lunchbox off to work. This is one I've seen myself on the Boston Common. This industry is hard at work, shaping a figure with his jackhammer, a common attribute of industry. Here's a female industry from the Chicago Board of Trade. The gear is another common element of representations of industry. She's paired with agriculture. This pairing is common to represent the mainstays of the American economy. This industry, again found with agriculture, is in a statue grouping from the Minnesota Capitol. The two are the women on either side, guiding the horses. It's unfortunate that the two don't have any attributes to tell us which is which, but together they guide the figure in the chariot whose prosperity. In Kansas City, Missouri, the spirit of industry is doubling up, holding a sheaf of wheat for agriculture and a distaff for manufacturing, joining agriculture and industry in one personification. It's interesting that the symbol used for industry here is a distaff, a female symbol. This may be seen as either a compliment, recognizing the importance of women in manufacturing, or as an insult, relegating them to a traditional role. Your choice. Finally, there's Rosie the Riveter. She's not officially a depiction of industry, but could certainly be used as one. This is the most famous picture of her. Norman Rockwell also painted one in which she's eating her lunch with a steam hammer across her lap. We've already seen agriculture paired with industry. She usually appears as part of a set of two or more other deities, and she's often depicted like Ceres. Or maybe said that Ceres is depicted like her, or even that the name of Ceres has been changed in America to agriculture. If so, then Ceres has changed from a goddess of grain to one who's a patron of all agriculture. Here she is in Indianapolis with a sickle for the harvest. This agriculture is from Chicago. We've already seen her partner, industry. Here she has her most common attributes, a cornucopia and a sheaf of wheat. Here is a statue of agriculture which used to stand at the Cotton Exchange in New Orleans. She was unfortunately broken up for fill to put under roads. Although agriculture is often found with the classical wheat sheaf, sometimes her attributes have been altered to reflect the local economy. Here then there's a cotton plant next to her. Other statues at the exchange included commerce and industry. This mural from the South Dakota Capitol building also takes a welcome step into specifically American imagery with maize instead of wheat. Another economic idea that's found personified is commerce. Sometimes we find it in the form of Mercury, but other times it appears under its own name. Here she is in Kansas City, Missouri, when she's paired with the industry we've already seen. Although she's not depicted in the form of Mercury, she does have Mercury's caduceus. This statue of Commerce from the Library of Congress is interesting. She holds a ship in her right hand, ships being fairly common attributes of commerce, but she holds a relatively modern locomotive in her left. It would be cool to see a new statue of her holding an open laptop, continuing the adaptation of deities to the time. In the Rhode Island Capitol, we're back to Roman symbolism. Even though she's represented as a woman, she wears Mercury's winged cap and holds his caduceus. She even has a Latin name, Commercium. Although that's definitely the Latin word for commerce, its gender is neuter. Since we have a goddess here, it would have been nice to create a new name, in the feminine gender, Commercia. Her dropping coins from her hand is a nice touch. To her right, a cherub carries a fairly modern ship, and to her left, another one holds a globe to symbolize international trade. It's not only economic ideas which are deified. This lovely science from the Pennsylvania Capitol holds Minerva's owl and is accompanied by the snake of wisdom. Although the words about her say that her veil has been disclosed by none, we see that she partly has been, which is appropriate for science, a never-ending quest. Another common personification, one related to science, is history. A frequent attribute of hers is a book or scroll. In the Kansas Capitol, she's an angelic figure reading one, while historical events go on around her. On the tomb of Stephen Douglas, on the other hand, she places one foot on books. And here in the U.S. Capitol, she's writing her own book. America's entered into the flow of history and now has its own story. It's fitting that she also measures the passage of time. Another category of abstractions is virtues. Any of them can be personified. Remember, though, that most Americans think of virtue in sexual terms, but from a pagan point of view, we have to look back at ancient Rome, where virtue was a goddess, but there the meaning was how a civilized adult should act. The virtues we would personify are especially those that are typically, even not exclusively, American. For instance, the Roman gravitas, a sort of withdrawn dignity and seriousness, just wouldn't fit us. Neither would obedience, although independence would be nice. Here's the virtue courage from South Dakota, and here's integrity from Cleveland and from the New York Stock Exchange. There are many other personified abstractions: wisdom, art, discovery, finance, law, motherhood, and so on. Here's a wonderful mosaic from the Rockefeller Center called Intelligence Overcoming Ignorance. The center figure is thought. She's accompanied by oral communication and written communication. These are so abstract that it's difficult to imagine them as objects of cult. While it may be easy to imagine praying and offering to thought, one might feel a little silly doing so with the two forms of communication. To make it worse, from the left of this trio speed science, publicity, medicine, and sports, and from the right head art, politics, religion, and drama. But are they really that different from the Greek muses, whose names simply mean what each one of them inspires? For instance, the name of Polyhymnia, the inspirer of sacred poetry, simply means she of many hymns. The only advantage these ancient muses have over our abstractions, who might be called modern muses, is that we moderns don't speak Greek, so they don't strike us as merely abstractions. Perhaps we should just translate the communications muses into Greek or Latin so we can feel more comfortable with them. We can pray to communicare verbum and communicare scriptum. The figures that fly from them can easily be seen not as spirits in themselves, but as ways in which the central three accomplish their missions. The final category is also made up of personified abstractions, but of a particular kind, of geographical or geopolitical entities. An impressive example of a geographical personification is this marvelous statue of the Mississippi River, the Father of Waters, from the Minneapolis City Hall. The Mississippi affects a huge watershed and carries a large amount of commercial traffic. His influence in our history and culture has been immense, from the Civil War to Huck Finn and beyond. Here's another Father of the Waters, this time from the Missouri State Capitol. Here the river's role in commerce is stressed, through the presence of Mercury's caduceus, a rudder, and an anchor. I wouldn't be surprised if there were more representations of the Mississippi along its length. Something that isn't a man-made image, or even an image at all, is Mount Uncanunic in Goffstown, New Hampshire. It's actually two large hills, the name of which means breast in the local American Indian name. This could identify it as an Earth Mother. It's especially appropriate that when you take a left curve on Route 101 between exits 8 and 7 and catch your first sight of the hills, there's a small round hill between you and them that makes it look as if a pregnant woman is lying there. As a link between geographical and geopolitical figures, here's Manhattan, which is both an island and a borough of New York City. The statue originally stood on one side of the Brooklyn entrance to the Manhattan Bridge. It was removed in the 1960s, but a replica of it was recently reinstalled. The same fates were shared by this statue, which stood on the other side of the entrance, representing Brooklyn. Both were designed by Daniel Chester French, most famous for designing the statue of Lincoln inside the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. States also have their protective deities, usually on, near, or in their capitol buildings. The Genius of Connecticut, Miss Penn, the Spirit of Kansas, Wisconsin, and my favorite, Mother Iowa. She presumably is offering her breast to nurse her children. Whatever the reason, good for you, Iowa, for not bending to the kind of pressure that bowdlerized the standing Liberty Quarter. So those are some, and only some, of the images and concepts which can be adopted as deities in an American paganism. Sure, the artists made them as allegories, but if they could change deities into allegories, I see no reason why we can't change allegories into deities. We could then modify them to make them as uniquely American as an American paganism would also be. So what do you think? Is an American paganism viable? And if so, what form should it take? This is a project that's in the early stages of development, and any input is valuable. If the project interests you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can follow it as it unfolds. Thanks for watching.